Hi everyone, it's Ryan from Majingo.com and welcome to a lesson on Flexbox, which is the element positioning tool coming to your workflow soon. This lesson is a high-level overview of what Flexbox is and how you can use it for layouts for which you'd previously deploy something like floats. So yeah, Flexbox will save you from floats and the other shenanigans that you've had to deploy for precise layouts. So what is Flexbox? Well, Flexbox is a short name for Flexible Box Layout, which is a specification from the CSS3 working group that allows you more control over positioning of elements inside of a parent container. Flexbox is gaining support in browsers, with almost all major browsers supporting the latest spec, with one notable browser a little bit behind. Flexbox is also an easier, faster, and more reliable way to handle precise layouts. And right from the spec itself, Flexbox is simple and powerful tools for distributing space and aligning content in ways that web apps and complex web pages often need. Well, what isn't Flexbox? Well, it's not really designed to be a page layout tool. For that, you'd really want to use the grid layout spec, but it's incomplete and there's really not any browser support. So it's not a viable option, and we're going to talk about grid in a future lesson. Now you can use Flexbox as a layout tool, and many people have. It's simple to do something like this 3-column layout right here with all of your Flexbox properties. So what does Flexbox do and how can it help? It allows you to arrange elements in a container called the Flex container without using floats or other methods that we're used to. It's called Flexbox because the elements inside the Flex container are flexible. You can stretch them, space them, and reorder them. Flexbox isn't just for horizontally laying out elements like we've done with floats. You can also lay out elements inside the container vertically too. And Flexbox frees you from the bounds of source order to determine the ordering of the elements on the page. With Flexbox, you can set the order of the items inside the Flex container. And while we're able to do this with current techniques, the Flexbox implementation is much less hacky and more reliable. Let's first identify the parts of the Flexbox. Now, I'm not going to regurgitate or recite the spec document, but instead we'll walk through some code and talk about Flexbox. First, we'll start with the Flex container. The Flex container is the containing element that holds the items you want to control using Flexbox. You can imagine this box as the Flex container. You're probably familiar with this method of working by using wrapper divs and other such methods to help deal with floats and layouts in your pre-Flexbox front-end coding. The Flex container is also a wrapper element. It is any element you want that has Flex set as the value for the display property. And you can see that here where we have the content class with display and then Flex. The element with the class of content, in this example it's a div, is now a Flex container. Anything inside of it will be influenced and manipulated using Flexbox functionality. So that's the first part of the Flexbox functionality, the Flex container. The second part are the Flex items. These items are any child elements of the Flex container. The pull quote div here would be a Flex item because it is a child of the content div, which we've assigned the value Flex to the display property. One helpful thing about Flex items is that you can't use float on them. So that's some good news. So we have two pieces of Flexbox, Flex container and Flex items. Each of these two pieces have properties that you can set on them to determine the positioning and behavior. We won't go into all of the properties in this lesson. That's something I'll save for another time, but I do want to keep talking about the structure of Flexbox so it all makes sense when you jump in to using these properties. With that in mind, let's move forward and dig a bit deeper. If you've read articles online about Flexbox, you were most likely presented with a diagram that looks something like this. I know, I had the same reaction. That diagram is directly from the spec. Instead of glossing over this and pretending like we all know what we're talking about, let's talk through it and then jump into using an example page. The large box is the flex container, and the flex container has two axes, the main axis and the cross axis. In this diagram, the main axis is the horizontal line and the cross axis is the vertical line. But that isn't always the case. The main axis could be vertical and the cross axis could be horizontal. Think of the main axis as the primary flow of the flex container and the cross axis as the secondary flow of the flex container. This will make more sense when we talk about flex direction. So on the flex container, you can set the flex direction property to either be row or column. This property defines the direction of the flex items in the flex container. Row sets the flex items to run horizontally along the flex container, left to right, unless you specify otherwise. And column sets the flex items to run vertically along the flex container, top to bottom, unless you specify otherwise. Okay, back to the main and cross axes and why they matter in this diagram. Setting the flex direction property to row will make the main axes run horizontally in the direction of the flow of the flex items in the flex container, and the cross axes will run vertically. Setting the flex direction property to column will make the main axes run vertically also in the direction of the flex items in the flex container, and the cross axes run horizontally. I keep talking about this diagram and the main axis and the cross axis, but really, why does this matter? Well, it matters because when you start getting more specific with the behavior of the flex container using properties like justify content and align items, you have to know how they will impact the placement of your flex items. In the case of justify content, the flex items will be distributed along the main axes, and when using align content, the flex items will be distributed along the cross axes. But if you don't know which of your axes is main and cross, then you're going to be a little bit surprised at how justify content and align content react to the values you input. So it's important to understand this. Let's look at the working example to see this in action. So in this example right here, I have a very simple setup. I have a div here with some runners in it, and we can think of this as a race course. And I have some runners, and we're going to manipulate these runners using Flexbox. And the div that is gray here, the box, is our flex container, and the runners are our flex items. So this div here that has the class of course, I set display to flex, and now this is our flex container. So this div right here, div class equals course, that is our flex container, and anything inside of that, like all of these images here, are the flex items. Right now, the flex direction is set to row. This means the main axis is running horizontally from left to right. The property here, justify content, has the value of flex start, and that means that the flex items, these runners here, are justified to the start of the main axis. And the main axis is running left to right horizontally, so they're all aligned or justified left along here to the start of the main axis. Now I can change this to, let's say, flex end, and now all of my runners will move to the end of the main axis. So these runners are bunched up together, and I want to spread them out evenly across my main axes. And to do that, I can use space between, and now the first flex item and the last flex item are set to the start of the main axis and the end of the main axis respectively, and then everything else is spaced out evenly. So that's the space between value for justify content. Another spacing option is space around, and what this does is attempts to evenly space them along the main axes. And the first item and the last item are not treated any differently. As you can see, they are no longer butted up against the end and the beginning of the main axes, they are now spaced evenly like the other runners. So let's set justify content back to flex start. So now we have all of our runners up against the starting line of the race. And now if I use flex direction of row reverse, now even though my justify content here is still flex start, the runners are all up against the right side of this container. Now why is this? Well, it's because I reversed the direction of my main axis. My main axis used to run left to right, with left being the start of the axis and the right side being the end, but now I've reversed that. Now the start is on the right side and the end is on the left side. So now all of the runners are justified to the start as I specified. And this is why I was saying it was important to know how your axes are set up, because it's really going to help you understand why the values you are setting are doing what they're doing. If you don't know it, you're going to start just typing a bunch of stuff in and not really understanding exactly what's happening. And believe me, I know this from working with CSS, because if you don't know the fundamentals of it, it gets really confusing and you end up having a lot of extra properties to do things when maybe if you or if I had a better understanding, I would have actually had much cleaner and simpler CSS. Now with this, let's look at setting the flex direction to column instead of row. So if I create this as column instead of row, and we're going to change our height here. We'll just change it to 1,000 pixels. Now the main axis is running vertically from top to bottom, and the cross axis is running horizontally from left to right, and the flex items orient themselves accordingly. Now you can see they are oriented like this. Now the reason that they are all aligned to the right is because I have align items set to flex end. And remember, this is our cross axes, which is how you affect alignment of the items. So now if I put that to flex start, they're all back at the start, and they're ordered down here from top to bottom along the main axes. If I set justify content to flex end, now my content is justified to the end of the main axis, which in this case is the bottom here. We can also use space between like we did in the previous example. And now my runners are spaced out along the div, with the first runner and the last runner being at the beginning and end of the main axis. And the same goes for space around, where we can attempt to evenly space them around. You can see we have space between all of them here, like that. Now the reason you see this first one butt up against here and the rest having a little bit of extra space is because a margin that I set on my class of first to allow that first runner to not have any space. So that's just a display thing, and that's why you're seeing that. Okay, so what about the cross axis? How does this work in our example? Let's reset our flex direction to row. And we'll change our container height here, make it a little bit smaller. All right, so we can control the location of the flex items on the cross axes. Remember, this is the secondary axis, by changing the value of align items property. So setting the align items property here to flex end will move our runners down to the bottom, to the end of the cross axes, which visually here is the bottom of our div. This is our flex container. Setting align items to center will center our runners, these are our flex items, in the middle of the flex container. And look at that, a perfectly easy way to center items every single time. So all of these properties are affecting only the flex container. We haven't actually set up any properties to deal with these flex items themselves, and there are properties that we can use to deal with flex items. So we're going to deal with that in a future lesson. I want to make sure we have the basics of the Flex container and how you can interact with it and what our main and cross axes are and how they work. So that's an introduction to the structure and workings of Flexbox. There are several properties for both Flex container and a lot for Flex items that I didn't cover, but I've provided links and information alongside this lesson for you to explore more until I have a future lesson on Flexbox. For more information and more courses and lessons on web development, go to majingo.com/learn. I'm Ryan Ireland from Majingo. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.